The stars above the Krillian homeworld flickered with a cold and distant light. The Krillians, a once mighty species known for their advanced technology and powerful empire, were now on the verge of extinction. Their home planet, Krill, was under siege by the Zirak, a fierce and merciless race of conquerors. These invaders, with their massive fleets and overwhelming firepower, had slowly but steadily wiped out most of the Krillian defenses. The Krillians had retreated into their last stronghold, a vast city hidden beneath the surface of the planet, but it was only a matter of time before the Zirak would find them and finish what they had started. With no allies left to turn to, the Krillian High Council made a decision, one that seemed almost unthinkable. They would send a desperate message across the stars to humanity. The Krillians had long viewed humanity with a mixture of disdain and curiosity. The human race was young, having only recently emerged as a spacefaring species, and their technology was far behind that of the Krillians. They had never considered humans a serious threat, nor had they imagined they would ever need their help. But now, facing the end of their civilization, the Krillians were desperate. The Zirak were too powerful, too numerous, and their victory seemed inevitable. There was only one hope left: the humans. The message was simple but urgent. To the human race, we are the Krillians. Our world is under attack by the Zirak, and our forces are not enough to stop them. We have heard of your strength and resilience. We implore you, send help. Your weak fleet may be all that can save us. The Krillians' communication channels were sophisticated, capable of sending signals across vast stretches of space, but they knew their message would have to reach Earth. The humans were far away, and the chances of them receiving the message in time were slim. But the Krillians had no choice. They had no one else to turn to. On Earth, the response to the Krillian plea was not what the Krillians had hoped for. The human military, led by a council of generals and political leaders, debated what to do with the unexpected message. There was skepticism, confusion, and even suspicion. The Krillians had never been particularly friendly with humanity, and their sudden plea for help raised many questions. Why now? Why ask for help from the humans, who were still learning how to navigate the galaxy? Admiral Jonah Burke, an experienced but unassuming officer, sat in a large conference room filled with high-ranking officials. He listened carefully to the message that had been received. The room was filled with murmurs of disbelief and concern. The Krillians were a proud race, one that had never shown much interest in human affairs. It seemed almost impossible that they would turn to humanity for help. Are we really considering this? General William Harrow, one of the senior officers, asked, his voice filled with doubt. The Zirak are not a force to be taken lightly, and we're still dealing with our own problems here at home. Should we really risk sending a fleet to aid a race that has never offered anything in return? Burke leaned forward, his fingers drumming softly on the table. He had always been someone who thought with a level head, and he had seen enough conflict to know when an opportunity, however unlikely, should be seized. We have a duty, Burke said, his voice steady. We can't ignore their plea. If they're asking for help, it means they're desperate. And we can't afford to turn away from a chance to make a real difference. The Krillians may not like us, but they're facing extinction. If we don't help them, who will? There was a long silence. The generals and politicians exchanged uncertain glances. They had never expected to be in this position, but Burke's words had struck a chord with them. If humanity was to make its mark in the galaxy, it could not shy away from difficult choices. Finally, General Harrow spoke again. Fine, we'll send help, but we're not sending our best fleet. It's too risky. We'll send our weakest fleet. It's all we can spare right now. Burke nodded. He knew the fleet in question wasn't exactly weak, but it was far from the state-of-the-art force that the humans had been developing. It consisted of older ships, some of which were nearing the end of their service life. The crews were young and inexperienced, and the technology aboard was outdated compared to the fleets of the Zirak or even the Krillians, but it was all they could offer. "Understood," Burke said. "I'll prepare the fleet for departure." In the days that followed, the humans scrambled to assemble the fleet. It was a mixture of ships from various military divisions, all brought together for a single purpose: to aid a race on the brink of destruction. The fleet's command would fall to Admiral Jonah Burke, who had been given the daunting task of leading an inexperienced crew into the heart of a war that could very well spell their doom. The Krillians, on the other hand, had no idea what kind of fleet would be arriving to help them. They were hopeful but nervous. They had heard of humanity's resilience, but would their weak fleet truly be able to stand against the might of the Zrak? The Krillian Council could only wait and pray that the humans' reputation for stubbornness and determination would be enough to tip the scales in their favor. As the human fleet departed Earth, heading toward Krillian space, no one could predict the outcome. Would the humans' weakest fleet be enough to turn the tide, or would it fall before the overwhelming power of the Zrak? For both the Krillians and humanity, the answer was still uncertain. But one thing was clear: their fate would soon be intertwined, and the galaxy would soon witness the results of humanity's first true test in the greater cosmic war. Admiral Jonah Burke stood in the command center of the fleet, looking out the large window as the stars streaked past. The hum of the engines was steady, and the faint vibration of the ship beneath his feet was comforting in its consistency. Yet, as much as he tried to focus on the task at hand, his mind kept returning to the message the Krillians had sent: a desperate plea for help. A race known for their pride and strength, now on the brink of extinction, and they were asking humanity for assistance. Burke couldn't help but wonder why. Why had the Krillians, with all their advanced technology and vast power, turned to a young, barely tested species for help? Was it because they truly believed humanity could make a difference, or had they simply run out of options? The silence in the command center was broken when Commander Leela Hartley, his second-in-command, approached him. She was a sharp officer, quick to assess situations and always on top of the details. "Admiral, we've received final confirmation from Earth," she said, her voice calm but carrying the weight of the situation. "The fleet is assembled and ready to depart. The Krillians are expecting us." Burke turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "Do they really expect us to save them?" he asked quietly, more to himself than to Hartley. "They have no choice," Hartley replied. "They're out of options. The Zrak have them on the run. If we don't step in, the Krillian Empire will fall." Burke nodded slowly, deep in thought. The decision to send the fleet had been made, but now the real questions began. Could they do it? Could this weakest fleet truly make a difference in the face of the Zrak's overwhelming power? Back on Earth, the political and military leaders were watching the situation unfold with a mix of skepticism and hope. The Krillian plea for help had raised eyebrows all around the world. The message had been sent across the stars, but humanity's place in the galaxy was still uncertain. While Earth had made progress in space exploration and colonization, it was still a young player on the galactic stage. General Harrow, the officer who had initially questioned whether humanity should get involved, sat in his office, staring at the view screen that displayed the human fleet as it prepared to leave the solar system. His face was grim, but his eyes betrayed the uncertainty he felt. He had agreed to send the fleet, but the reality of the situation was beginning to settle in. The Zrak were ruthless, and the Krillians had been unable to stop them. The Zrak's reputation was legendary, and even the thought of going up against them felt like a suicide mission. "Do you think they'll make it?" one of Harrow's aides asked, standing nearby. "I don't know," Harrow replied, his voice filled with a quiet frustration. "The Krillians were too proud to ask for help until now. That tells me they're desperate. But sending our weakest fleet, it doesn't sit right with me." His aide didn't respond, instead opting for silence. Both of them knew that there was nothing more to be done now. The fleet was on its way, and humanity's fate was in the hands of Admiral Burke and his crew. The journey to Krillian space was long, and the fleet's morale varied from ship to ship. Some of the younger officers were excited about the prospect of their first real mission, but the older veterans knew better. They had seen how quickly a battle could turn against you, and they understood the difference between theory and reality. Admiral Burke spent most of his time in the command room, making sure everything was running smoothly. He knew that this mission was more than just a battle for the Krillians. It was a test for humanity as a whole. The future of human space exploration, alliances, and influence in the galaxy could hinge on how well they responded. As the fleet approached the Krillian system, Burke gathered his senior officers in the briefing room. The stars ahead of them were a distant, cold backdrop as he looked around at the faces of those who would fight alongside him. "We all know what's at stake," he began, his voice steady and commanding. "The Zhrak are not just another enemy. They are a powerful, well-organized force. But they also underestimate us. They see our fleet, and they think we're weak. That's our advantage. We fight smart. We use what we have to outthink them." One of the officers, Lieutenant Travis Miller, spoke up. "Admiral, with all due respect, our ships are outgunned and outclassed. We're not going to win this with tactics alone." Burke turned to face him, his expression firm. "I never said we would win it, but we can make sure the Krillians have a fighting chance. That's all we need to do." Another officer, Captain Elena Morales, added, "And we're not just going up against the Zhrak. We'll be rescuing an entire species. Their survival depends on us." The room fell silent for a moment. The weight of the mission was beginning to sink in. They weren't just fighting for victory. They were fighting for the survival of an entire race. Burke continued, "We may not have the latest technology. We may not have the numbers. But we do have something the Zhrak don't. We have determination. We have the will to fight. And that's what will carry us through." The officers nodded, some more convinced than others, but all of them now understood the gravity of what they were about to face. Their fleet may have been called the weakest, but in that moment, they felt a renewed sense of purpose. Back in Krillian space, the Zhrak fleet loomed on the edge of the system, its massive ships like dark shadows against the backdrop of the stars. The Zhrak commanders were confident, their ships organized and prepared for the final assault. The Krillians were cornered, their remaining forces barely able to defend themselves. The Zhrak didn't know that help was on the way. They didn't know that a fleet, smaller and weaker than their own, was headed straight for them. The Krillians, still hiding in their underground cities, could only pray that the humans would arrive in time to make a difference. As the human fleet approached, both sides prepared for the battle that was sure to come. The stage was set for a clash that no one, not even the Krillians, could predict. The human fleet arrived at the edge of Krillian space. The stars stretched in endless blackness before them. Admiral Jonah Burke stood at the helm of his flagship, the Odyssey, his eyes scanning the view on the large screen. It was quiet, eerily so. The vastness of space was unnerving, but what unsettled Burke more was the fact that they were now about to face an enemy they knew very little about. For weeks, the fleet had been traveling through the cold void, pushing through with determination, even as doubt crept into the hearts of some officers. They were about to face the Zhrak, a race known across the galaxy for their brutality, their skill in war, and their enormous fleets. "They should be here by now," Commander Leela Hartley said, her voice tight. She stood beside Burke, her gaze fixed on the empty space ahead of them. "Where are the Krillians?" "They said they were waiting for us." Burke clenched his jaw, his eyes narrowing. The Krillians had sent their message, pleading for help, but now they seemed suspiciously quiet. Were they still hiding beneath their planet's surface? Were they even still alive? "They're out there somewhere," Burke said, trying to sound reassuring. "We'll find them." But the truth was, Burke wasn't sure. The Zhrak were ruthless. Their presence in Krillian space had already been confirmed. The humans had only limited information about their enemy, but what they did know was enough to paint a grim picture. The Zhrak didn't just conquer planets. They obliterated them. and the Krillians were next in line. As if on cue, the sensors on the Odyssey suddenly blared to life. The large screen shifted, showing the faint outline of a fleet, a Zirak fleet. It was enormous, dark, and menacing. The Zirak ships were unlike anything the humans had ever seen. Massive vessels, with jagged edges and glowing, hostile red lights, filled the screen. "Confirming enemy fleet," said Lieutenant Travis Miller, his voice tight with disbelief. "It's the Zirak. A full battle group." Burke took a deep breath, his pulse quickening. This was it. The fight had begun. He stepped forward, his mind racing. There was no turning back now. "Commander Hartley, give the order," Burke said calmly, though inside he was anything but. "Tell the fleet to prepare for battle." Hartley's face turned pale, but she nodded and turned to relay the command. The fleet began to shift into formation, preparing for a fight that could determine the fate of an entire species. The human ships, though older and slower than their enemies, were nimble and agile, capable of maneuvering in ways the Zirak hadn't anticipated. The Zirak ships, on the other hand, were designed for destruction. They were big, heavily armed, and built to break through any defense. As the human fleet began to take position, Burke's eyes remained locked on the screen. He had a plan, one that depended on their ability to outmaneuver the enemy, but he couldn't ignore the sheer scale of the Zirak threat. The size of their fleet alone was enough to crush them in moments. Still, Burke had to remind himself of the one thing that had gotten them this far: humanity's ability to think outside the box. "They're closing in," Hartley said. "The Zirak aren't wasting any time." Burke nodded. "They want to crush us quickly. But that's exactly what we're going to use against them." The first shots rang out across the void as the Zirak fleet fired its deadly barrage. Massive energy beams streaked through space, their destructive power lighting up the blackness like a storm. The human fleet scattered, evading the shots with quick, sharp turns. The human ships weren't built for direct confrontation, but they were built for speed. They zipped around the larger Zirak ships, dodging the oncoming fire and keeping the Zirak from getting a clean shot. It was chaotic, the sounds of the battle almost deafening in the silence of space. Burke watched with intense focus as his fleet executed the first phase of his plan, a series of evasive maneuvers designed to confuse the Zirak. It was a gamble, an attempt to make the Zirak believe that the humans had more firepower than they did. "Stay on course," Burke ordered. "Keep the pressure on them. Do not give them a chance to regroup." Despite their advantage in speed, the human ships were outgunned. Every time they tried to get close enough for a counterattack, the Zirak retaliated with massive bursts of firepower that left craters in space. "Admiral, they're firing on the Krillian base," Miller shouted, his voice filled with alarm. On the main screen, the human fleet could see a large cluster of explosions erupting on the distant surface of Krill, indicating that the Zirak had located the Krillian stronghold. "We have to stop them," Burke said through gritted teeth. "Hartley, take the Odyssey in. We'll cut them off before they can do any more damage." The Odyssey surged forward, breaking away from the formation. The human fleet, though not nearly as powerful, followed suit. They were outnumbered and outmatched, but there was one thing the Zirak hadn't counted on: the humans' courage. The Zirak fleet, confident in their superiority, underestimated the humans' unpredictability. They had expected a quick surrender or a desperate attempt to flee. What they didn't anticipate was the humans' ability to fight in a way that no one else in the galaxy did, by never backing down. As the human ships darted between the Zirak's massive warships, launching hit-and-run strikes, they began to damage the outer layers of the Zirak fleet's defenses. Though the humans didn't have the firepower to completely destroy the Zirak ships, every shot, every evasive move, every quick strike took its toll on the larger fleet. It wasn't enough to win the battle, but it was enough to make the Zirak realize that the humans wouldn't simply lie down and be crushed. The Zirak fleet commander issued orders to change tactics, starting to focus on the human ships in a more direct way. But for the moment, the humans had gained a small advantage. They had bought themselves time. Time to protect the Krillian base. Time to help their new allies. Admiral Burke didn't have much time to celebrate. He could see the damage mounting on his ships, and the Jirac were not backing down. Yet despite everything, one thought kept echoing in his mind. The humans had taken the first step in showing the galaxy something the Jirac had never expected: human resolve. The battle was far from over, and the odds were still heavily against them, but the humans had made their mark. The Jirac knew now that this would not be an easy victory. For the first time, the Jirac were beginning to realize that they might have underestimated humanity. The battle raged on. The dark, jagged Jirac ships fired relentlessly, their weapons lighting up the cold expanse of space. The human fleet, though smaller and weaker, moved with precision, evading the majority of the attacks and countering with quick, calculated strikes. Admiral Jonah Burke stood at the command center of the Odyssey, his face set in grim determination. Every decision he made now would affect the lives of hundreds, maybe thousands. "Admiral, we've lost another destroyer," Lieutenant Travis Miller reported, his voice tense. "The Defender has been hit, and its shields are failing. It won't last much longer." Burke's jaw tightened. He had known the risks from the start, but hearing the news still stung. The Defender was one of their older ships, yet its crew had fought bravely, making every shot count, even as their own systems failed one by one. "Patch the fleet's communications through to me," Burke ordered. He needed to see the bigger picture, to understand what was happening with the entire fleet. The Jirac weren't just attacking the ships, they were testing them, pushing them to their limits. The screen in front of him flickered and then displayed a live feed of the fleet. The human ships were scattered, weaving between the larger Jirac vessels. Some ships had taken damage, but none had fallen completely. But it wasn't just the ships that were at risk. The Krillians, hiding beneath the surface of their home planet, were running out of time. Burke knew that if they didn't act soon, they would lose not only their ships but the entire Krillian race. "Admiral," Commander Leela Hartley said, her voice carrying a sense of urgency, "the Jirac are closing in on the Krillian city. If we don't do something now, they'll destroy the last of Krill's defenses." Burke glanced at the screen. The Jirac had begun to concentrate their firepower on the Krillian stronghold, and the damage was already visible. Explosions erupted in the atmosphere of Krill, sending clouds of smoke into the sky. "Send the fleet in. All ships, focus on the Jirac fleet. We have to buy time for the Krillians," Burke commanded. He was taking the huge risk. The human fleet was already stretched thin, and launching a direct assault on the Jirac would only increase their losses. But if they didn't act, the Krillians would fall, and the war would be over before it had truly begun. As the human fleet advanced, the Jirac commander, a massive alien named Khazar, watched the humans' movements from his flagship. He had been observing their tactics for some time, and though he had initially dismissed them as nothing more than a minor annoyance, he was starting to reconsider. These humans were unlike any enemy he had ever faced. They didn't fight like the others. They didn't cower or surrender when they were outmatched. They fought with something he hadn't expected: resilience. "Captain, send in reinforcements," Khazar barked. "These humans will not break. We must crush them now before they get any ideas." The Jirac ships began to shift, their massive weapons primed for a final decisive blow. But Khazar underestimated one thing: humanity's ability to adapt. On the Odyssey, Admiral Burke felt the pressure mounting. The Jirac were responding with overwhelming force, and they were starting to corner the human fleet. The last thing Burke wanted was for the fleet to be destroyed. They couldn't afford to lose another ship. Yet, as the battle pressed on, he noticed something. The Jirac, despite their overwhelming firepower, were becoming predictable. "Commander, I want all ships to pull back just a little. We need to get them into position," Burke said, his voice filled with quiet certainty. Hartley looked at him, confused. Pull back. Admiral, they'll have us cornered. We need them to think they've won, Burke explained, a plan starting to form in his mind. Once they believe we're retreating, we can hit them where it hurts. The human fleet started to pull back, moving in what seemed like a disorganized retreat. The Zirac, seeing this, took the bait. Khazar's ships surged forward, eager to finish what they had started. The Zirac commander believed that the humans were out of options, that they were finally running from the battle. But what Khazar didn't know was that the humans were not running. They were setting a trap. Now, Burke shouted, all ships engage at full power. The human fleet, which had been retreating in an apparent panic, suddenly turned back on the Zirac. The ships surged forward, weapons charging with newfound energy. The Zirac fleet, already in pursuit, was caught off guard. The human ships, though outnumbered, used their superior maneuverability to strike at the Zirac's weaker points. The smaller, more agile human ships darted between the larger Zirac vessels, firing in quick bursts. The Zirac fleet, despite its size and strength, found itself struggling to keep up with the unpredictable human tactics. The Odyssey, under Burke's careful command, moved with precision, targeting Zirac ship after Zirac ship. The humans' earlier retreat had been a clever ruse, allowing them to hit the Zirac with surprise, precision, and force. Burke's heart raced as he saw the first of the Zirac warships begin to break apart. The tide was turning, but it wasn't over yet. Keep the pressure on, Burke yelled into the comms. We're not done yet. On the surface of Krill, the Krillians watched in awe as the human fleet turned the tide of battle. From their underground cities, they had seen nothing but despair for so long. But now they saw hope. The humans were not just fighting to survive. They were fighting for them. The Zirac ships, though massive and powerful, were beginning to falter. The Krillians couldn't believe it. Was this really happening? You said they would never help, one of the Krillian commanders said, his voice filled with disbelief. But they have come for us. The humans, they fight for us. The other Krillian commanders nodded, their eyes wide with a new respect for the humans. Back in the heart of the battle, Admiral Burke's fleet pressed on. The Zirac, now on the defensive, were trying to regroup, but the human fleet wouldn't give them a chance. The Defender, despite its earlier damage, launched one final volley of missiles at the closest Zirac ship, sending it into a fiery explosion. Burke looked at the screen, his heart pounding. The Zirac were retreating. Slowly, they were falling back. Commander Hartley, Burke said, his voice steady, we've won this round, but we've only just begun. The Zirac might have been forced to retreat for now, but Burke knew the battle was far from over. The humans had gained a victory today, but there were many more challenges ahead. The human fleet had done the impossible. They had bought time for the Krillians, and for the first time, the Zirac realized that humanity was not to be underestimated. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless, and for Admiral Burke and his crew, it was proof of what humanity was capable of when faced with the impossible. The hum of engines and the quiet crackle of the ship's communication systems filled the command center of the Odyssey. Admiral Jonah Burke stood at the front, his eyes locked onto the massive screen in front of him. The human fleet had scored a hard-won victory, but Burke knew better than to get comfortable. The Zirac weren't a species to admit defeat so easily. They had been driven back for now, but they would return with a vengeance. Admiral, we're getting a distress signal from the Defender, Lieutenant Travis Miller reported. They've sustained severe damage, and their systems are failing. Burke clenched his fists. Send a rescue team. Get them out of there. The human fleet was battered and bruised, but they had fought with everything they had. It wasn't enough to win the war, but it had given them a moment of breathing room. Burke couldn't afford to waste it. Commander Hartley, Burke said, turning toward his second-in-command, we need to reinforce the Krillian defenses. The Zirac will regroup, and when they do, they'll be even stronger. Hartley nodded, her face tight with determination. "We're ready, Admiral. We've shown them we won't back down. Let's make sure they understand we'll fight until the end." As the human fleet maneuvered to support the Krillian stronghold, Admiral Burke couldn't help but notice the tension in the air. Every crew member on the Odyssey was aware that the next battle could be the one that decided the fate of the galaxy. The Zrak weren't just invaders. They were a force of nature. The humans had barely survived their first encounter, and they knew the Zrak would be back with greater firepower. "All ships, get into position," Burke ordered. "We're not giving the Zrak a chance to strike first." The ships of the human fleet positioned themselves around the Krillian homeworld, their weapons charged and ready. Burke could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The Krillians were counting on them. The entire galaxy was watching. But it wasn't just the Krillians who depended on this fight. Burke knew humanity's future was at stake too. If they lost this battle, there would be nothing left to fight for. The Zrak, however, were not idle. Khazar, their ruthless commander, had already begun to plot his next move. His fleet had suffered losses in the last engagement, but nothing that couldn't be repaired. He had learned from the humans' tactics. They were quick, clever, and full of surprises. But Khazar had never lost a battle, and he was determined to make sure the humans would never get the chance to win again. "Captain," Khazar growled, his massive frame looming over the Zrak officer at the controls of his flagship, "send out a full assault. I want the humans to know what real power looks like." The Zrak fleet, larger than ever, began to move toward the human position. Khazar was counting on the element of surprise. The humans were overconfident after their victory, and he would exploit that. Back on the Odyssey, Burke's eyes scanned the radar, and his heart sank. The Zrak fleet was coming. In greater numbers. The size of the fleet on the screen seemed almost impossible. It was overwhelming. The Zrak had learned their lesson, and now they were determined to break the human resistance once and for all. "Admiral, the Zrak are coming in full force," Lieutenant Miller said, his voice strained. "They'd got us outnumbered at least 5-1. Burke swallowed hard. It was the moment he had feared. The Zrak were about to strike with everything they had. There was no time for hesitation now. "All ships, engage evasive maneuvers," Burke ordered, his voice calm but firm. "We need to buy time for the Krillians to evacuate. Do not let them get close." The human ships scattered, their engines roaring as they dodged incoming fire. The Zrak, with their massive warships, responded in kind, unleashing a barrage of firepower that lit up the dark void of space. The human fleet was faster, but the Zrak were relentless. Every shot they fired seemed to land with the power of 1,000 storms. It was a test of endurance. The humans needed to last long enough to give the Krillians a chance to escape. "We're losing shields on the Eagle, Admiral," Commander Hartley shouted. "Their defenses won't last much longer." Burke's hands tightened on the console. The Eagle had been one of their toughest ships. If it fell, the humans would lose one of their few remaining warships. He knew that if they didn't make it out of this battle, the Krillians would be left defenseless, and humanity's chances of surviving the war would drop to almost zero. "We can't give up," Burke said, his voice steely. "They think we're weak, but we're stronger than they realize. We'll make them regret underestimating us." Khazar's flagship loomed on the screen. It was a massive beast, a floating fortress of destruction. The Zrak fleet was moving in to crush the humans, and Burke could see it all coming. But he also saw a chance, a way to turn the tide. "Commander Hartley, I want you to take the Odyssey straight at their flagship," Burke said, his voice firm. "We'll hit them where it hurts. If we can take down Khazar's command ship, the rest of the fleet will lose their coordination. The Zrak will panic." Hartley looked at him, uncertainty flashing across her face. "Sir, that's crazy. We're talking about a ship that could take on an entire fleet. We don't have the firepower to take it down." "We don't need to take it down," Burke replied. "We just need to make them believe we're crazy enough to try. Make them react." It was a desperate plan, but Burke knew it was the only way. The Zrak had no idea how far the humans would go to win, and that was their advantage. The Odyssey surged forward, its engines roaring as it raced toward the Zrak flagship. Burke's heart hammered in his chest. It was a suicide mission, but it was the only hope they had. The Zrak didn't know what hit them. The human fleet had scattered, but now they were regrouping for a bold, daring strike at the heart of the Zrak. The Zrak flagship fired a devastating barrage, and the human fleet danced around the shots with astonishing agility. The Odyssey took a direct hit, its shields flaring, but it held. Burke gritted his teeth as the Odyssey rocketed closer to the Zrak flagship. "We're in range," Hartley said, her voice tight with anxiety. "Ready to fire on your command." Burke's hand hovered over the controls. He looked at the massive ship ahead of them. If they could land just one direct hit on its command center, they could disrupt the entire Zrak fleet. "Do it," Burke ordered. The Odyssey fired, and the shot collided with the Zrak flagship. The ship shuddered, and for a moment, everything seemed to freeze. Had they done it? For the Zrak fleet, the impact was devastating. The flagship's control systems flickered. Khizar gritted his teeth, furious. The humans had not only dared to attack, but they had succeeded in shaking his confidence. On the Odyssey, Burke knew the battle was far from over. But this was the first true sign of hope they'd had in a long time. The humans had struck back. But now, both sides knew one thing for sure. The battle was far from over, and this war would be decided not by brute force, but by resolve. The Odyssey shook violently as another wave of Zrak fire slammed into its shields. The screens around Admiral Jonah Burke flickered as his command ship groaned under the pressure. He gripped the edge of his console, his knuckles white. The battle was far from over, and though they had dealt the Zrak a blow with their daring attack on the flagship, the human fleet was still outgunned and outnumbered. Every second counted, and the situation was becoming more desperate. "Admiral, we're taking heavy fire from their right flank," Commander Layla Hartley said, her voice strained. "If we don't reposition soon, we'll lose the Odyssey." Burke's mind raced. The Odyssey was the flagship, the heart of the human fleet. If it fell, the rest of the ships would likely follow suit. He couldn't afford to lose it. "All ships, fall back to a defensive position," Burke ordered, his voice steady despite the rising pressure. "We can't keep pushing forward like this. We need to buy time for our damaged ships to regroup." The human fleet began to retreat, but it wasn't a full retreat. They moved with purpose, placing themselves in a defensive formation around the Krillian homeworld. The Zrak fleet, sensing the shift, surged forward with renewed aggression, determined to destroy the human fleet once and for all. "Sir, we've got multiple Zrak ships closing in on the Eagle," Lieutenant Travis Miller shouted. "They're targeting our weakest ship. We've got to protect them." Burke's heart sank. The Eagle had been taking hits for hours, and its shields were barely holding up. The Zrak had figured out the weakness of the human fleet, and were exploiting it. "Prepare to engage," Burke said, gritting his teeth. "All ships, focus fire on the Zrak vessels targeting the Eagle." The Odyssey and the rest of the human fleet moved into position, focusing all their firepower on the Zrak ships threatening the Eagle. The energy blasts from their weapons lit up the dark void of space, creating an intense, chaotic scene. The Zrak retaliated, their weapons tearing through the human ships, but the humans fought back with fierce determination. Meanwhile, on the surface of Krill, the Krillian commanders watched the battle unfold from their underground bunkers. Their faces were grim as they observed the humans' courage in the face of overwhelming odds. The Krillians had always known their planet was a target, but they had never imagined they would find an ally like humanity. "Are we truly seeing this?" one Krillian commander asked, his voice thick with disbelief. "The humans are holding their ground. They're sacrificing everything to protect us." The other commanders nodded, their expressions filled with awe. The Zrak were a force to be reckoned with, yet the humans had not only survived, but also managed to push them back at crucial moments. It was clear to the Krillians now. Humanity was their last hope. We must give them everything we have, another commander said. If we don't support them now, we will lose this fight, and possibly our world. Back on the Odyssey, Burke was pushing his fleet to its limits. The Zirac fleet had reorganized after the Odyssey's daring assault, and now they were coming at the humans with full force. The human fleet was beginning to show signs of wear. Some ships were losing shields, others were taking critical damage. The Zirac were relentless, their superior numbers pressing the humans harder with each passing moment. "Admiral, we've lost contact with the Phoenix," Hartley reported, her voice tight. "It's gone dark. We think it's been destroyed." Burke's jaw tightened, but he couldn't let himself be distracted by the losses. The Phoenix was a valuable ship, but the battle was far from over. The Zirac had taken some hits, but they were still advancing, pushing the human fleet back inch by inch. "We can't give up now," Burke muttered to himself. "We've got to push them back." He turned to his crew. "Prepare for a counterattack," he ordered. "I want all ships to charge forward. We're going to hit them hard, take out their command ships, and break their formation." The human fleet moved forward, weapons firing in rapid succession. The Zirac ships tried to retaliate, but the humans were quick, nimble, and unpredictable. The smaller human ships darted around the larger Zirac vessels, striking at weak points. Burke's plan was risky, but it was their only chance to create a real opportunity for victory. "We're getting close to their flagship, Admiral," Lieutenant Miller said, his voice rising with excitement. "We have a clear shot at their command center." "Take it," Burke ordered, not hesitating. "Now is our chance." The Odyssey fired with all its might. The shot pierced the hull of the Zirac flagship, hitting its command center. For a moment, the entire Zirac fleet seemed to falter. The flagship shuddered, its lights flickering, and its weapon systems went offline. The Zirac fleet was no longer coordinated. The humans had succeeded in disrupting their control. "Now's the time," Burke shouted. "All ships target their remaining command ships. We can win this if we finish them off now." The human fleet rallied, pressing forward with everything they had. The Zirac, disorganized and struggling to regain control, began to retreat. The human ships, though damaged, pressed their advantage. They knew they couldn't stop now, not while there was still hope. On the surface of Krill, the Krillians watched in astonishment as the Zirac began to retreat. The humans had done it. They had turned the tide of battle. "Look," one of the Krillian commanders exclaimed. "The Zirac are retreating. They're falling back." The other commanders exchanged looks of disbelief and relief. For the first time in weeks, they allowed themselves a moment of hope. "We owe them everything," one commander said, shaking his head. "Without their intervention, we would have been wiped out. We must prepare to offer our full support to the humans once the Zirac are gone." Back in space, Admiral Burke saw the Zirac retreating. It was a sight he had longed for, but he knew better than to celebrate too early. The Zirac would regroup, and they would return. But for now, the humans had won. They had driven the Zirac back from the brink of total destruction. "Admiral, the Zirac are retreating," Hartley said, her voice filled with disbelief. "We've won. We've actually done it." Burke exhaled slowly, a weary but satisfied smile crossing his face. "For now, yes. But this war is far from over. We've bought the Krillians time, and we've shown the Zirac that we won't back down." He paused, looking out at the stars. "Humanity has proven something today. We might be small in numbers, but we have the strength and will to survive. And that's something the Zirac will never understand." The battle wasn't over, but the victory was a turning point. Humanity had fought against the odds and against a powerful foe, and had emerged victorious. The Zirac had retreated, but they would return. Yet the humans had proven that they would always rise to the challenge. For now, the galaxy would remember the bravery of the human fleet. They had given hope to the Krillians, and to themselves. And as the battle raged on, One thing was certain. The war had just begun, and humanity would fight until the end. The Zirac fleet had retreated for now, but Admiral Jonah Burke knew this battle was far from over. The Odyssey had been battered, its hull scarred by the Zirac's relentless assault. Yet the humans had survived. They had struck back with everything they had, and the Zirac had underestimated them. Now they would regroup and plan their next move. The question was, would humanity be ready for them? The silence aboard the Odyssey was palpable. The crew, though exhausted, remained vigilant, knowing the Zirac wouldn't stay away for long. The battle was only paused, not won. Burke stood in the command center, his eyes fixed on the stars outside the viewport, his mind racing. How many more battles would it take to drive the Zirac away for good? And could the humans keep fighting with such ferocity? Admiral, we've received a transmission from the Krillian High Command. Lieutenant Miller reported. They wish to speak with you directly. Burke's heart skipped a beat. The Krillians had been allies in name only before the battle, but now, with the Zirac temporarily pushed back, they had a new sense of urgency. They had to decide what came next, for their planet and for the galaxy. Put them through, Burke ordered. The holographic image of the Krillian Supreme Commander, Commander Zalm, appeared before him. Zalm was a tall, armored figure with an air of solemnity, his features sharp and his voice grave. Admiral Burke, Zalm began, your people have proven their strength today. We are in your debt. Burke nodded, grateful for the praise, but knowing this was not the time for celebration. We did what we had to do, but this war is far from over. The Zirac will come back. We need to make sure we're ready for them. Zalm's gaze hardened. Yes, our scouts report that the Zirac are regrouping. They've begun repairs on their fleet and are building new warships. They'll return with more force than ever. Burke's jaw tightened. Then we must prepare. We can't let them hit us again when we're still recovering from the last battle. We need reinforcements. Zalm nodded slowly. You have our full support. We will mobilize all our resources and prepare to fight alongside you. However, we must ask for something in return. Burke raised an eyebrow. What do you need? We need your fleet to hold the Zirac at bay while we gather our forces. Zalm said, his tone earnest. We are strong, but our homeworld is not prepared for a full-scale war. Your fleet is faster, more mobile. We need you to provide a shield for us until we can mobilize our armies. Burke paused, considering the request. The Krillians had no choice but to ask. Without their homeworld, they had no hope of resisting the Zirac. Burke understood that, but that didn't make it any easier. The human fleet was already battered, and the Zirac weren't known for mercy. We will do what we can, Burke finally said. But you must understand, this will be our final stand. If we fail, both of our races are finished. Zalm gave a single nod. Understood, Admiral. May our forces stand together until the end. As the transmission ended, Burke turned to his crew. All hands, we're preparing for the final push. The Zirac think they can crush us, but they haven't seen what humanity is capable of. Let's make sure they never forget. Across the galaxy, the Zirac had been hard at work rebuilding their forces. Commander Khazar, the Zirac leader, had been furious at the surprise strike the humans had delivered. The human fleet, now bolstered by Krillian support, moved into position to meet the Zirac head-on. The Odyssey, though damaged, was ready for the fight. Admiral Burke stood in the command center once more, his face set with determination. All ships, form up, Burke commanded. We fight for our survival. We fight for the Krillians. And we fight for every planet in this galaxy that stands against the Zirac. This is our final chance. The fleet moved into formation, and the battle began. The Zirac fleet came in like a storm, their weapons flashing with deadly force. The human and Krillian ships met them head-on, their weapons lighting up the darkness of space. The first wave of Zirac ships crashed into the human line, and the battle raged with fury. Admiral, The left flank is weakening. Commander Hartley shouted, "We need to reinforce." Burke's mind raced. The Zrak were relentless, and their firepower was overwhelming. But the humans weren't backing down. "Hold the line," Burke ordered. "We need to hold them off until the Krillians can bring their heavy artillery into play. Don't give up now." The human ships pressed forward, despite taking heavy fire. Each ship seemed to carry the weight of the entire war, but they were holding their own, using their speed and agility to strike at the Zrak wherever they could. The Krillian fleet, their massive warships finally in position, unleashed a barrage of firepower. The Zrak flagship, Khazar's command ship, took the brunt of the attack, its shields buckling under the intensity. Burke's heart pounded. If they could bring down Khazar, they might have a chance to break the Zrak's will. "All ships, focus on the flagship," Burke shouted. "This is our moment." The Odyssey and the other human ships surged forward, their weapons firing with precision. The Krillians joined in, their firepower adding to the onslaught. The Zrak flagship began to falter, its systems failing as the humans and Krillians focused all their fire on it. Khazar's flagship exploded in a massive fireball, and the Zrak fleet seemed to lose their coordination. Their ships began to retreat, disorganized, as their leadership crumbled. The human and Krillian fleets pressed forward, capitalizing on the confusion. "We've done it," Lieutenant Miller shouted. "The Zrak are retreating." Burke exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The battle was over. The Zrak had been driven back, but there was no time to celebrate. "Prepare for any counterattack," Burke ordered, his voice steady. "We've won this battle, but the war is far from over." The Zrak were retreating, but humanity had proven something they never could have imagined before. In the face of overwhelming odds, the humans had fought with courage and determination. The war was not over, but the tide had shifted. For the first time, the Zrak knew that they were not the only ones who could bring destruction to the galaxy. Admiral Burke looked out at the stars, the weight of the galaxy pressing on him. This victory had come at great cost, but humanity had shown the universe one undeniable truth. When pushed to the edge, they would never back down. And as the human fleet sailed into the unknown, they were ready for whatever the future held.